Singapore has seen an increase in international travellers this year, but only a fraction of tourists are under the Vaccinated Travel Lane scheme. According to Singapore Tourism Board, there were 67,760 international visitor arrivals in February and about 57,000 in January. Most of them were people visiting friends or staying with relatives here, not spending as much on tourism. With more is our transport correspondent Toh Ting Wei. Ting Wei, until Singapore eases restrictions to allow all fully vaccinated travellers to enter the country, essentially doing away with the VTL scheme, will tourism ever recover to pre-pandemic levels?
So regardless of what Singapore does with the VTL scheme, the tourism will recover to pre-pandemic levels this year for sure. And I mean, by international forecast, it has been estimated that international tourism and air travel will recover maybe around 2024. So there are several reasons for this, some within Singapore's control and some out of Singapore's control. But the way the VTL scheme is structured is definitely one of the issues which will limit the recovery. But the VTL scheme itself has kicked off the recovery for Singapore's tourism and air travel sector. There are some issues with it, which means that you can't get anywhere near to pre-pandemic levels. So one example is the arrival cap in terms of the number of VTL visitors that can come in daily. So we are looking at that number now, and it's 15,000 VTL arrivals a day. So that's quite far off from what Singapore had in terms of arrivals daily. So if you count transit passengers based on 2019 numbers, there seems to be around 95,000 people entering Changi Airport on a daily basis. And when you look at the VTL cap, it's 15,000. So it's quite far off. Plus, demand is not so high at the moment. So I don't think the cap is being maxed out on a daily basis. That's one issue. And the other issue with VTLs is because you need to be from a selected list of countries, 32 countries currently. And you also have to take designated VTL flights into Singapore. So when you have the issue of a designated flights to tap the scheme, the problem is that the demand for the flights are a lot higher compared to demand for non-VTL flights. So essentially what will happen is that for designated VTL flights, the ticket prices will go up and it will make it less attractive for people to try to come here. But beyond the VTL itself, there's really a lot of other issues that needs to be addressed before we can talk about a full recovery in tourism. For example, you have regional markets like Indonesia, Thailand, and other countries which are slowly opening up but not fully open yet. There are still testing requirements and things like that. So as long as they are not fully open, the demand for tourism to these markets won't be back to pre-pandemic levels. And that also means that there will be fewer people stopping over in Singapore before going on to these countries. So this was actually kind of a major tourism market for Singapore before the pandemic. So that's one thing. And you have China remaining closed in terms of its borders. So it means Singapore lose a big source of tourists. And also other things like the testing requirements in Singapore, even though now it's quite minimal, and also domestic restrictions like mask wearing and limits on group sizes. So these are all things that come together to deter people. And lastly, and most importantly, there's also in terms of the demand from travelers. While there is some pent-up demand, there are also a lot of travelers who are still reluctant to travel because of the COVID-19 situation, be it in Singapore or other countries, and the fear that their trip might be disrupted by a COVID-19 infection. So it's really a lot of things to consider, but VTLs are one of the things that Singapore can reconsider to try to boost tourism.
Ting Wei, you explained quite a bit on the external factors and you mentioned regarding the domestic restrictions. And let's focus on that. How much of a hindrance you think our domestic restrictions would be to attracting tourists?
So it's hard to quantify the impact of this because I don't think any proper study has been done to see how travelers get turned off by the idea of having to wear masks, for example. But I would think it's probably quite a big factor. Because if you are thinking from the perspective of maybe a tourist from Europe, say the UK, wanting to fly to Southeast Asia, and say Singapore in particular, when the person looks out the restrictions locally, it will feel quite different from what the person is already experiencing in UK or even countries like US. So in terms of COVID restrictions, Singapore is still pretty strict compared to other countries. So you have to talk about things like downloading a contact tracing app, wearing of masks everywhere, dining in groups of 5, not being able to drink alcohol after 10:30, no live music, and things like that. And taking from the perspective of a foreign tourist, you would think that's quite restrictive. I mean, because for them, they have already lived past the life during a pandemic. They have gone through restrictions like this, like mask wearing and such, and coming from their country where these restrictions have mostly been lifted into Singapore to face all these restrictions, I think it's quite a deterring factor. And anecdotally, I've heard of people who have come here and who felt very uncomfortable by these restrictions. Other things like the lack of a nightlife scene in Singapore now because of the COVID situation, and to tell people that they come here and they stick to groups of 5, nothing more. It's also another big issue because I mean, like if you have big families coming here, it's not possible for them to kind of travel separately, eat separately, because that's not really what they want. I think for that, it's hard to quantify, but it's definitely a big turn off compared to other destinations where there are fewer restrictions.
So, bearing what you've just said, how is Singapore then preparing for more tourist arrivals, and what is it doing to increase its appeal as a leisure destination?
So for that, it's really dependent on the COVID-19 situation. But we have talked to STV for the story that we did today, that was in today's papers. So what STV is doing is, in terms of several areas, working with the tourism industry. So one key thing is recruiting more manpower. Because with the pandemic over the last 2 years, there's been kind of a talent drain in the industry. Whether you're talking about aviation or you're talking about the tourism industry, there are people like there's foreign manpower who left and haven't returned. There's Malaysians who also haven't returned as well. And then we have people who left the industry for better prospects. So now, even as Singapore prepares to welcome more travelers, the issue is that there's a manpower, like there might be a manpower crunch. So STV and the industry is working to bring back in more manpower to handle the increased demand. And also there's also new kind of like, they have continued trying to push for new experiences and new attractions throughout these 2 years to prepare for more people to come in. So example is a push for wellness tourism. So wellness tourism is a kind of a new thing in Singapore where they want to showcase Singapore as a place where you can come and participate in activities which kind of improves your health. So that's one aspect that Singapore will be pushing for. And you have events like the F1, which is supposed to return this year, and there's a 7-year contract for that over the next few years. So that will bring back more tourists as well. Then there are also various things like this upcoming Children's Museum that will open in December this year. So it's supposedly the first museum in Singapore that's dedicated to children. And this will be located at Coleman Street. Then there's also a rebranding of the Fort Serapong in Sentosa to brand it as a tourist attraction. And then you also have things like the container hub, the container hotels and such. So it's more of trying to increase the number of attractions in Singapore, trying to help businesses have the requisite manpower while waiting for domestic restrictions and VTL restrictions to ease.